10:30. We have a healthy number of attendees, and because I'm with my favorite people talking about my favorite topic, let's get right into it. We are joined here today with some of the most incredible thinkers on freedom of information and also creative thinkers, practitioners. We'll be getting into some real tips. And so I just want to thank the NFOIC for giving us an opportunity to talk with people who are at Columbia Journalism School like Azmat, at Newmark's Graduate School of Journalism like Lam, and Ava, who is a lawyer at the Cornell Law First Amendment Clinic. We got a lot of schools represented up in here, a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge. But I want to take us back to a moment where you maybe didn't have as much knowledge about FOI as you do now. I want to hear from everybody about your first experiences filing public records requests. And as you think about what those examples might be, I am happy to kick it off sharing what my first experience of public records looked like. I remember hearing about the Freedom of Information Act when I was in law school, not before then. And just thinking it made zero sense. I was like, you are telling me, a person from a heavily surveilled, heavily policed community, I grew up in a Muslim community of Pakistani immigrants in Southern California, I can just fill out a piece of paper and ask the government anything I want, and they're supposed to get back to me. I mean, this seems really counterintuitive. And I was so optimistic and totally taken with the what could be in this process. I then, filed a FOIA request to the Department of Navy that was answered 11 and a half years later. So we just recently started getting responses at the Yale Media Freedom Clinic. So there was a lot of excitement about the potential of what FOI could bring, and then a little bit of disappointment about the timelines, although I've had other requests that have been much more fruitful. And those are sort of my early framing memories. There's a lot we can expect. Sometimes reality disappoints us, but I might go start with you, Lam, do you remember your earliest memories around FOI and what got you into this space?
So I think I was always the person who was not allowed to report because I had valuable technical skills. When you have specific skills in a newsroom, you become a glass of water in the desert. And so oftentimes I'd have to do reporting on the side. And FOI was one of those tools that no one told you about would unlock so much in terms of investigations, in terms of the long form type of reporting that was always reserved for people that weren't me or didn't look like me, right? And so for me, FOI was like, wait, what is this thing? Let me try and figure this out. And I don't know who it was, but someone was like, why don't you go to the FTC? Because that's the nicest agency about freedom of information, because it was like baby steps. File this FOIA requests, get some data about consumer complaints, because the government does not look bad when people are complaining about stuff, right? Especially when they're complaining about Amazon and other things to the FTC. And then go through all of these steps. The officers would follow up with me and were like, hey, do you want to do this? You should get this data. I was like, oh, I forgot, what is this? And so I think it was like a really interesting opener into this secret world of knowledge that only investigative reporters have. And as someone who basically had to patchwork her career as a journalist on weekends and nights, and then eventually a little bit further into the week and so on, and then now in the past 3-4 years full time, this was a really revolutionary tool that I have now used over and over again to request the weirdest stuff. But I think in many ways, I I now aggressively share any knowledge I have about FOI with other people, because I think it's like a tool that was gate kept from a lot of people who didn't even know exactly what investigative journalism was, which was me, and then never understood how to navigate that.
Yeah, and that's definitely a theme I want to pick up with you, Azmat, about your work with the Gumshoe Group and sharing expertise. But before we come to you, Lam, I know you've also done really interesting work with the Legal Aid Society and helping folks get into FOI there. Can you talk to me a little bit about that too? Because that feels like an important early endeavor that you were working on.
So interestingly enough, I was more of an expert coming in talking about social media data, and basically because that was my expertise, and I was able to basically lay out how much information lives on the internet about you. These lovely folks from Legal Aid Society who were working with kids who were in gang databases came to me and were like, hey, can you just do this presentation? And then through that, I learned basically, I presented my work at BuzzFeed, and then the kids were like, there's so much information about me. And that kind of stirred them to file a FOIL request with the NYPD just to see whether they are in the gang database. Now, I don't think they ever actually got it through, but I think together with, as these workshop series went on, I think they were able to get 500 teens to file FOI requests with the NYPD. And if anything, it's kind of like a sign of, no, we want to know our information from the youth in a way that maybe the NYPD wasn't dealing with before.
I think that's so interesting because it also frames FOI as an avenue into some type of civic engagement, right? You're like, wait, I want to ask about this. And then even when you get a no, which does not surprise me, the NYPD gave out some no's on gang databases, it is a prompt to be like, okay, well, how else can we get this? Should we get this? Should we be advocating for that? And I think that is a really interesting way to think about FOI, not just as a journalistic tool, but something sort of more broadly, because of course it is a right of the public, not just a right of journalists. Azmat, when I started working with you at BuzzFeed, I just remember you having these stacks of paper and these requests to every federal agency you could possibly imagine. And I'm sure that was not your first time at the FOIA rodeo, but could you tell us about how you got into FOI requests?
Absolutely. And that's such a great question, simply because I remember before I'd ever filed a request, I thought about it like it was a astronomically difficult thing, just because of the way that maybe some reporters talked about it. They talked about it like it was the kind of thing that it took years of expertise to master, that it was something extremely complicated. They talked about it like it was like complex data journalism or programming. And so I remember thinking like, gosh, it's going to be really hard, and sort of like psyching myself up to do it. And I remember the very first time I wrote one, I actually think it was local in Michigan, maybe related to Detroit's bankruptcy or a particular legal case I was looking at within the city of Detroit. And I did a first draft, and I was pulling up resources to learn how to do it. And I was like, I couldn't have done this right because it was so simple. Like, this is supposed to be very hard. And I emailed all of these journalists I know who were very experienced in dealing with FOIA or with different kinds of FOI requests. And they were all like, yeah, it's great. You did a good job. That's perfect. That's all you need. And I remember being like, really? It's that easy? Why did people make it sound so hard? And, of course, it can be complicated. There's strategies you can use that can maybe give you a better position in some cases if you're dealing with something more complex. There are, they're particularly notoriously hard places from which to get records, but the basic blueprint for how to get records is really simple. And if you haven't already, I would really encourage anybody to look at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press's FOIA Wiki, that's a federal look, but they also have different state request sort of guidelines in sort of teaching you how to put in requests, what particular things mean. And it's a great step for beginners. You really see that in many ways, it's almost like a template, right? You're identifying, you're using the same specific language, you're thinking about the time periods of records. There are the records have to exist already. There are things that you have to know, sure, but it was not nearly as hard as I thought it was. And when I got the records, I was like, wow, is this easy? I want to do this again and again. And also, why did people make it sound so hard?
I think that's such a good observation. I think there does feel like there's a bit of gatekeeping, and it is complicated. There is expertise in it, but anyone can get started. And that does feel like something for folks who are getting into this space to realize, like, you learn through trial and error. Now, Ava, you sit on sort of a different angle of FOI work because you are the person who people come to say, how do I file this? They didn't say yes. I want to litigate. And so can you talk to us about your early days of getting familiar with FOI, and then talk a little bit about it from the legal side too?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having us here to talk about this very fun and very important topic. My kind of gospel of FOIL, it kind of came to me pretty late. I would say really only in the past year. I feel a little bit embarrassed admitting that. My background was as in-house counsel, which meant that I was always just like putting out fires. And if someone came to me with a FOIL request, I'd be like, that's great. Go do this. I'm so happy you're doing this. Come to me if there's a problem. And I think if you got that message from your lawyer, you would probably not go back to your lawyer because you will realize that they weren't prioritizing it. In my current role, I'm super, super focused on local journalists in the New York City metro area, which means that I have learned the ins and outs of New York City and New York State agencies, which has been a blessing because FOIA is a huge, huge topic. You can think about it at the federal level. You can think about it at the local level, like just one small school, one small town. You can think about the state level. So I've had this incredible opportunity to have journalists come directly with me. So I don't have to generate ideas. They come to me with ideas and say, hey, I want to try and get this information. What's the best way to go about it? And I am like a lifelong tattletale. So, basically people come to me when they're having a hard time and I get very extra, like, how is someone, you're just trying to do your job. You're just trying to be a journalist. You're trying to report the news. You're trying to inform the public and, really be a stand-in for the public and you're getting blocked. And so, it's been both exciting to see the enthusiasm of journalists in the face of encountering so many difficulties along the way. So I have a slightly different message from Azmat in that people come to me when the thing is no longer easy, usually, and saying someone's just saying no, or they're not responding to me, or it's this agency and I know they're going to be difficult, or the press person from this office is denying me, so we're going to have to pursue a different strategy. But I would say that the lesson I've taken away is that persistence and patience are really, really important. And I think patience is probably a little bit undervalued in our current moment. I have reporters who have been waiting on things for 2.5 years, but they keep going because as it turns out, often there's a reason someone is withholding something. They don't want you to have it and it's usually not a nefarious reason that they don't want you to have it, but it really encourages persistence and steadfastness and a lot of things that Lam was talking about. I think it can be just a great tool to learn about the obligations that the government has to you. And it's also a great way to learn how to navigate the law, because it's not especially complicated as an area of law. It just takes a lot of patience.
I definitely agree that patience is kind of the biggest tip I could give in this space. And in a few minutes with later questions, I want to dig into practical tips and tricks for folks who are on the call. Also, I know people have questions. In just about 15 minutes time, we'll open it up to questions to everybody. So guys, keep thinking about good, juicy questions. Before we get there, I want to talk about an interesting phenomenon that I've observed when I've been doing FOI trainings with folks, and especially with younger journalists. There'll be a lot of like, I don't even know where to start or why I should do this. Some of it's because of the gatekeeping kind of approach that Azmat laid out. Some of it is just like, it sounds like a legal complex thing. And I was wondering if we could spark the imagination of folks who might be watching this with examples of reporting that you think used FOI really brilliantly or really well. Because I think it's always nice to look at something inspirational before we get to talking about tips and tricks of how to do it, which we will after this. And with that, Azmat, you've done so much work that's used FOI in such creative ways. So I might start with you on this one.
Sure. I can talk about my own work, but to be honest with you, the freedom of information that I'm most impressed by, blown away by, is actually by a journalist named Asia Bandawi. And she is a filmmaker who grew up in a suburb of Chicago called Bridgeview, Illinois, where everyone she grew up with, it's primarily a Muslim American, Arab American immigrant community suburb, really felt, in the 90s growing up, that they were being surveilled by the US government, and yet they were unable to prove it. And years later, as she's, an incredible investigative journalist, she decides, you know what, I want to use my journalistic prowess to investigate this. I'm going to start putting in Freedom of Information Act requests into the FBI about this operation that, it turns out did exist, called Operation Vulgar Betrayal. And I'm going to try to get all of these documents. And the thing that she did that I thought was so creative was that oftentimes an agency like the FBI, any agency actually, will deny requests for information about people. So for example, in this case, she wanted records of their surveillance, what they were doing in these communities, the people they were profiling, what they were actually documenting about them. And a lot of agencies will deny those kinds of records from ever becoming public, not just, if an investigation is ongoing, that's one reason why they might, but in this case, it was closed. And a reason for denial would be privacy, that look, these are private individuals who've not consented to have this private information about them released. And Asia basically started going door to door in her community and getting people to sign privacy waivers to include in her lawsuit. Now, whether or not that was ultimately successful is besides the point, in that, to kind of draw this back to, and by the way, it was a very successful lawsuit. She has gotten incredible records that have detailed things about her own family, about others in the neighborhood, that really proves what so many suspected for a very long time. And there were no prosecutions or anything significant that came out of this, but it's like the first real window into the pre-9/11 counterterrorism industrial complex here in the United States and surveillance. So, she's been getting these records, doing these incredible things with them. But to get back to what I think it did really well is that it brought in that civic engagement aspect, right? She's now going into the community, telling people that this exists. You can file these requests, you should file if you want to. I'd love for you to sign a privacy waiver for mine. I'll show you how to do this. And, it now opens it makes people aware of what was happening. It involves them in that process, which I think is an incredibly powerful thing to do. One of the problems sometimes with journalism is that they can be at a distance from the communities they're reporting on, or not really leverage or involve them in that as agents or, very active people in it. And what she did, if you have a chance, I would recommend this film. She produced an entire film about this FOIA, this very ambitious FOIA effort of hers, as well as just what was really happening in her community. And it's called The Feeling of Being Watched. And you can watch it on almost any platform. I think it's on Amazon Video. But it's a short documentary it's not short, it's like an hour, a little over an hour, but it's just brilliant. And I think it's one of the best introductions to this aspect of civic engagement, using creative ideas for FOIA, and then really serving the communities that you most intend to with your journalism and reporting.
Azmat, I love that example. And I have to underscore just how fantastic the film is. I would strongly recommend anyone watching it. And you're totally right to frame it as a civic engagement project. It just shows you what FOI can do, not as like a legal doctrine or a thing for one story, but how it can really have impact bigger than that. And I know we're talking about millennial and Gen Z perspectives on FOI. I think encouraging folks to understand that this is a larger project of civic involvement is also true to the original spirit of what FOI was supposed to be. It was supposed to be that the government is getting larger. There's more and more administrative processes. We want individuals to be able to have some oversight. And that is a form of civic engagement. And I just think this film is a fantastic example. Lam, what are some examples of FOI work that you have found really inspirational?
So I think one of the things that I've been seeing a lot is just the ways in which people are filing requests for things that aren't traditional means of communication. And I think one of the things that really stuck to me early on was just sort of how, I think it was the Texas Tribune that was able to file FOI requests for DMs and on Twitter. I think what we are very used to is communications that are through email. A lot of people do requests for calendar agendas and so on. And that really opened up a whole new idea of like, oh, what else is out there that is part of our new electronic communications that we could file requests for that people don't necessarily see as something that's important, right? Like, and then one of the things that we did at BuzzFeed with Peter Aldous, who's a very fun data journalist to work with, we wanted to look into automated software that flags violent behavior on social media to school directors and so on. And we filed 40 different FOI requests for school districts, and then we're able to narrow it down to looking into the alerts, the automated alerts that were being sent to email accounts of teachers. And underneath those emails in the exported Outlook file, you could find so much metadata that was not apparent at first. And I think finding a way of understanding how the internet works, the plumbing of our communications works, has helped myself and so many other colleagues of mine in the tech and investigation space kind of like look under the hood of what other information we could look into, right? I know that Surya Matsu does a lot of really interesting research into like what may be hidden underneath like sort of the code, the head of like a website and so on. There's a lot of folks who have been doing that kind of digital forensics to better understand what they can mine from seemingly simple websites. And so I think that has been the most interesting part to me. And Nabiha, you and I have always worked at the intersection of the stuff that isn't governed by laws yet. Anyway, right? Like the stuff that is sort of like so new that people are like, wait, should that be regulated or not? And so for us, it's been sort of like a really fun experiment of like, okay, how far can we poke the system before it collapses on us? And like, I think that was always an interesting way of like seeing FOI as well, kind of like pushing the boundaries and seeing just what we can achieve with what we can ask for, right? In different realms that people haven't kind of poked around in yet, just because the technology is so new that the laws haven't caught up in regulating it.
I love making the spotlight on the ways we can understand these sort of more modern communication systems that feel relevant, because I think there is this perception that like FOI is about getting like dusty files from like some corner somewhere. And yes, it's that, and also it can be things like different types of, you know, DMs or other data that is more cutting edge, and that's not always what people think of when we talk about FOI. Avo, what are your favorite examples of FOI inspired work?
Well, naturally, it's one of my clients, of course. So we work with an incredible organization called Documented that covers immigration throughout the United States, and they're just an incredibly impressive and small shop of journalists. And as I said, no creativity on the clinic's end. We filed suit on their behalf to obtain a set of information from the New York Department of Labor around labor violations and just complaints in general, with the idea, and I can share this because it's in the filing itself, that they would build it into a database. And I've seen the kind of first draft of the database, and I kind of typed in my zip code to see who in my neighborhood has been the subject of a complaint. So that could be withheld wages or some kind of, poor working conditions. I think it's a violation of the labor law. And I will, we've sued the Department of Labor once. There's a universe in which we could have to do it again because of how difficult it has been to get just to comply with basic timelines for information, believe it or not, that the federal government actively posts. So I think that, just to reiterate the idea that across different agencies and across different jurisdictions, there can be a huge variation in how accessible data is. And it's why I love the FTC story. It's, if you're interested in doing FOI work, you can pick your targets and think about how to be successful in that way. But the idea that this, immigration focused, incredibly small outlet would basically take the place of the government in a way to share information that could be useful to a huge swath of people who are maybe choosing where to work, but also as a consumer, I of course care if my local coffee shop, it has, 10 labor violations. They didn't, I looked them up specifically. I was very happy to find that. But just to take this data and transform it into an incredibly useful tool was, I'm like honored to be working with them.
I mean, we've surfaced so many different inspirational stories that now I'm like, I just want to go file some public records requests. And I think this is maybe also the time of our time together where we can move into tips and tricks to help the folks who are watching, because there's a lot of questions around how do I get metadata? Can I request this? There's lots of detailed questions. And before we get into those, I would love to talk to all three of you about just what are the tips and tricks that you wish you had known when you were starting out, or things that you're like, oh, this is a helpful place to look. And Ava, I'll start off with you. You surfaced one that Lam had mentioned about, picking your targets, making sure you go to agencies that have information that is not only interesting to you, but a likelihood of getting it. What are other tips and tricks you've seen from sort of the legal side of things of like, oh yeah, that's effective?
So laws work on precedent, right? So that's generally how our legal system works in the US. So whenever someone comes to me for a FOIL question, yes, I have a baseline set of knowledge from just looking at dozens of these on any given day, but I go to the source, which means in my case, I go to the Committee on Open Government, which is a New York agency that is designed to serve the public and theoretically hold New York agencies accountable. And they have a series of advisory opinions, which don't have the binding force of law, but they kind of help situate you and are certainly persuasive. And you can kind of cite them to an agency that's giving you difficulty, and you could certainly cite it in a legal brief if you're pursuing that. They also have summaries of cases from the past 30, 40 years, 50 years even. It's really the mid 70s when kind of FOI laws really came into effect. So I keyword search and, look for what has happened before, and look how things have evolved over time, and do a lot of just me grinding homework. And, and there are a lot of resources out there that exist because there's a secret community of FOI nerds. So the Reporters Committee wiki is great. They also have a huge summary of New York FOIL cases. So I start with what's there and then see how I can differentiate myself or compare to what's happened before. And I think that's, that's fundamentally what lawyering is. And to the extent that FOI is often, a legal process, I think journalists applying that framework to their research is the best thing I can possibly advise. It can be a little bit tedious sometimes, but it's worth it.
But I also surfaces, I love that tip. And I also use the keyword search on the Committee to Open Government. And I think it surfaces something really interesting that folks who are just getting into it might not always realize, which is that, there's the federal FOI, but there's also states. And states, it really differs from place to place at the markup. And this is actually something that we first did at BuzzFeed, but now we've also done it at Markup, which is creating a 50-state FOI template engine. So you can very easily ask exactly the same query across all 50 states and then see the differences in the responses you get. And it has been really fascinating to see the same type of question for something like a data set handled very, very differently in different states. In New York, the sort of Committee on Open Government structure that we have makes it pretty easy to go in, keyword search for data set and say, hey, you have to give this to me because of here's the precedent, like this is what we have to do. And anyone can do that. You don't have to be a lawyer. Anyone can do that. And then there's other states where you'll see that, the FOI officer is the same as the press person for the agency. It's an under-resourced office. There's not a lot of money, and you have to do a little bit more hands-on work. I have found just to educate folks on what's going on what you're asking for, and why it's important that you have it. And it just depends on the state you're in. Now, on that theme of reaching out, being a human, and using that to solicit important information, Lam, that's my transition to you, because you are so effective at really treating FOI officers like they're human beings and being quite successful in getting things from them. So I'd love if you could talk to us about tips and tricks in that space and any others that you have, because I know you teach people about this all the time.
So I think one of the things that's always worked against and for me is that I will forever look like a 14-year-old kid that no one takes seriously. Well, it works. So one of the things, as we mentioned, is like you get a lot more when you're nice to people. I often feel like a lot of government officials see an FOI request as a hostile attack on them. where they're like, oh, I have to do a thing and you are mean to me and we're gonna get into this sort of like head into a fight over information. And so one of the things that I've taken on, especially because I do a lot of FOI requests with data, is that I put my educator hat on and my I am very nice and sweet hat on, and then I follow up very consistently over time, but with a lot of sweetness. Hi, I'm available. If you want to talk to me, I'm happy to explain this. Especially in the realm of data, this is important because most people do not know how to properly even understand my requests. I come in with a request that says, here's a list of 26 columns I want in my data. And also I want a data layout, which means I want you to explain every column. And I want you to give me a general dictionary of what all of this information actually means. And so with all of this like jargon-filled information, a lot of FOI officers are stumped, walk away, probably don't want to look at it after they acknowledge it. And then to keep on hearing this like very sweet, hi, how are you doing? I just wanted to make sure that, I'm available to talk to you on the phone, has been really, really, really helpful in terms of just like getting that information. In many ways, FOI has also been a way for me to jumpstart those conversations. So I've been requesting information from several different courts in Texas, and some of the clerks don't know at all what I'm talking about. And some of them are like, oh yeah, we've done this many times. And sometimes it also means, that also depends on the size of the jurisdiction that they're in, what kind of capacity they have. And like, when you come to the table with a lot of empathy, I think people will take that with, people will really, really, appreciate that, and sometimes even waive some fees for you. So, and I think in many ways, a lot of it has to do with building relationships, because likelihood is that if I need the data now and I'm working on a story that's going to take another year, if I come back in 6 months and ask for another thing, they're probably going to be much nicer to me when I'm nicer to them from the get-go. And so, yeah, you catch a lot more flies with honey than with vinegar. Is that the saying? I think so.
Life lesson in general.
Exactly. It's a good life lesson. And you know what, I think there's so many things that are so insightful about what you just volunteered. But I think in this sort of theme of civic engagement, there's such a perception to think of FOIA as this adversarial process, like me against the government. And it can certainly be that way at times, right? Particularly when you get into litigation or, agencies who are withholding records for a variety of reasons, like embarrassment or fear of accountability. But it's not always that way. And I think framing it as this is a part of the political process, and like any process, some parts can be easy, sometimes it can be hard, and you just got to try to understand, which one you're dealing with. I think that's really helpful to reduce some of the barriers to getting into this space. Azmat, you have trained so many people on how to use FOI through your work with Gumshoe Group, which I would love to share with the folks who are watching this. What are your tips and tricks? You have so many. I think you could actually, each of you could write a book about FOI, but that's a whole separate project. What are your tips and tricks that you'd love people watching to think about?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are quite simple. They're like, be very specific, and it depends on your approach about what you're asking for. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was seeking records about an incident involving an airstrike that the United States had done in Iraq. And it was a single incident I wanted the US military, the Pentagon's own assessment into, because there was an allegation of a civilian casualty. And so I knew a record had been produced. And instead of just saying, look, I want this assessment about this incident on this date, I gave them very specific information. I said, look, it occurred on this date, at this time, but it may have also occurred, it might be logged as, Iraqi time instead of, the time zone that the airbase was using. If you're having trouble locating it, I've been in communication with this particular person at CENTCOM who has been telling me about this, and I'm attaching our emails, as an attachment here, where he says this is the date it was, it conducted, this is the date that the assessment was complete, and it was like an attachment or an exhibit within the FOIA, and his email address was included. So there was no way that they could be like, sorry, we can't find this, or sorry, this is too complex, because all of that was suddenly there for them. And I did it in a very clear, organized way. So that's what I mean by being specific. If it's something that might be confusing for them, show that you have that and cite their own sources. So I often cite their own press releases about an event that I'm trying to get information about. I attach, that agency's own release, and where it's basically like, I forget the exact language I use, but it's like, to assist you in locating these records, please see your own press release on this date that identifies this, attachment or exhibit A. Another thing that I realized is that, I take this kind of approach to FOIA and all kinds of reporting as kind of, let me try to exhaust all options. I know that maybe 95% of these efforts I'll make are not going to work, but the ones that do, it's really going to be worth it. So let me try hitting every base. So I'll start from scratch, like I know nothing about the grounds for which expedited processing is granted, right? So, it can take years to get FOIAs from the military. And I wanted it to be processed quickly. I wanted to be given expedited processing, which they don't really necessarily give. And from the way most people talk about expedited processing, it's that, it's primarily granted in instances in which there's a lot of public interest in this. It's really going to show important operations of the federal government, and like the public really wants to know. And the public did not care about airstrikes, and I knew that, right? So I'm sitting there and I'm looking at this and I'm like, well, let me just like open up the book on what the guidelines are for FOIAing CENTCOM. And I just looked at their grounds for expedited processing and saw one I hadn't seen before. I think it's something that distinguishes the military from some other agencies. But, there's the grounds for public interest and, federal operations. There's a grounds for imminent harm and a grounds for humanitarian harm. And those two were really fascinating to me. And I was like, well, actually, the person who was the target of this airstrike, he had basically told me that he feared that if his name wasn't cleared, because the United States had targeted him in this airstrike, dubbed him as ISIS in doing so, that rogue militias, when they would retake Mosul, would target him and accuse him of being ISIS. And so this record was important to him clearing his name. It was an issue of imminent harm. And I attached news reports about reprisal violence being subjected to people in cities and towns where ISIS had taken over. That was part of my evidence. I attached a report in which he had, gone to the US Embassy and said, look, I'm really afraid. I'd like my name to be cleared. I'm afraid these things will happen to me. And I included that within it. So I was demonstrating that imminent harm, and I was granted expedited processing. And that's how I was able to get that record that really, in an investigation I worked on for 2 years, I wound up getting a record that really, I think, made that hit home for many people, a record that showed what really went wrong with that airstrike. And really raised important questions. And, I was able to do that because I had just looked up, I was like, let me just look at the rules. Let me get creative. Let me try everything. And so I actually argued on all three grounds, but I know that the one that was most compelling was this one that I had not really thought about that creatively before or had heard other reporters really talk about. And it actually became the basis for all of these future requests that are part of this very large project that I've been working on, that, I then, in my article that came out, I talked about that imminent harm with respect to not just him, but others. And so in subsequent requests, I included as an attachment my own reporting showing that imminent harm, right? So I actually wrote it into my work that was, then published in the Times and said, look, the New York Times, or, these are published pieces that show that this is a real threat. So think creatively about these kinds of things, get specific. And if you really want something, give it that kind of attention that might, really make this a little bit easier on their end, a little bit more straightforward if you decide to sue. And, here's where I'd kind of like to talk about the Gumshoe Group a little bit.
Please.
Which really came out of an effort by another freelance investigative journalist and I, Seth Freed-Wessler, when we were both, trying to get people to take on our cases, right? Because you as a journalist can only sometimes take it so far before you need to sue, and you need legal help for that. And it's expensive. And there are all these clinics and people who might help you pro bono, but it can be really hard to navigate that space and get people to say yes, or to do it on a time frame that makes sense for your reporting schedule. And so, both Seth and I had encountered this where we built these networks for ourselves, where we'd gone to different people and we thought, why don't we make this more accessible to others? Why don't we match up investigative reporters who have really great FOIA requests, who've hit that roadblock, but don't know how to meet a lawyer? Let's put these networks of freelance investigative reporters who don't have the benefits of a newsroom or a dedicated lawyer or whomever it might be, those kinds of resources you often have within an institution. Let's connect them with this whole network of different kinds of people, and let's pair them in places and in ways that are really strategically smart. And so if you go to gumshoegroup.org, you can apply for that kind of assistance and that kind of connecting with a lawyer who can assist you. You can take part in FOIA trainings. And then one of the things that I think is really important that I don't think we've discussed yet, is that oftentimes the reason, I think why FOIA can sometimes be so inaccessible for some is that your story doesn't get published until you've completed this process, right? So especially if you're a freelancer, and a growing number of investigative journalists are freelancers, you're not going to get paid to do the work that you're investing in your FOIA, that time and that patience, until something is ultimately published. And that can be years. So it certainly advantages some reporters over others. And so at Gumshoe, we put our heads together and we thought, why don't we distribute cash payments for people to just file FOIAs, to put in that time and effort, because it can often be lots of research. I just gave you examples of the kinds of documents I might attach in a FOIA, or the kind of research I might do to show or demonstrate the things that I'm claiming in my request. That takes time and you never get paid for it. And so you can actually apply for micro grants to assist you in that kind of FOIA reporting. And all you really have to do is turn in your filed request. Once you're approved, and I think we just gave out 12 grants to different investigative reporters, and we're actually scaling that up in the coming months. So you can find that application on our website as well.
That is, there's so many tips that you guys have just surfaced. And Azmat, I think actually a theme for all three of you is understanding that FOI is a process run by human beings, and that approaching it requires being kind of savvy about what that process looks like, but that doesn't mean it's opaque. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's you got to do the legwork to call people. You got to think broadly about what goes into these pieces, what is other reporting or other evidence or other things you can do to make it easy for the person getting the request on the other side. And I love, Ava, I love your advice of thinking about what the precedent might be in that space to help someone along, especially if they're not sure this is something they can give you, if it's something like a record layout of data or something that's a little bit on the cutting edge. I want to, Azmat, you do such a good job of surfacing one of the emerging frustrations that journalists might have because they don't get paid until the end. And so there's now, as a result of a change in the industry, a sort of different structure of how people think about the frustrations here. And so I want to bring in some of the great questions we're getting and ask everybody, what are the common frustrations that you're seeing in this space, that people who might be new to FOIA or distrustful of the government might be seeing, and how do you navigate those frustrations? Lam, I want to start with you.
I think one of the things that's really hard is that it just takes a long time, right? And I think, as Azmat mentioned, the timeline is just so staggered for whatever department you're requesting it from, or what kind of information you're asking for. And I think in many ways, the best bet is to try and plan the majority of things without FOI until you really need it, right? And get that stuff in early. So it's this bizarre thing where you have to juggle so many different avenues of getting the same information at the same time, and tend to each one of them in different ways while you're working on that project. And what I mean with that is that for some things, it should be very simple to get data, but oftentimes it's not. So what I have to do is oftentimes kind of report around it, DIY my own data sets while I'm waiting for some FOI requests that may end up being the heart of my story. But in the meantime, I really have to cover all my bases. And like in many ways, the organizational part of this has been something that I've had to really, really work on to make sure that I don't forget about an FOI once I've filed it while I'm doing all this other reporting. And so in terms of frustrations, it's really just consistency over time and juggling multiple juggling multiple things and making sure that you don't drop the ball on any of them.
Yeah, that's certainly a frustration, just making sure that you're on top of deadlines, you're keeping other people on top of deadlines, you have your I's dotted and T's crossed. What about you, Ava? What are some frustrations that you commonly see and how do you navigate them?
I would say too, and they're definitely related to a little bit of what Lam talked about, but it turns out the government is a little bit behind technologically. Like it's easier for me to schedule a manicure online than it was to get a vaccine. So, it's in terms of the technological skills of government. I had a client who was incredibly frustrated with an agency it was seeking records from. And I finally get on the phone with them and realized that they had only digitized their records in the past couple of years. So they just didn't have to get the data that this journalist wanted was going to mean going to a warehouse and sorting through, and they had mixed all the records together. And I think so much of the world is so digitized, but the government isn't, because it hasn't really invested in that infrastructure in a lot of ways. It's recognizing that fact up front when you're thinking about your request and being smart about timelines and maybe doing a little bit of upfront work to understand how those records are stored in the first place. So you don't waste 3 months with no one responding to you and they're like, oh, we just don't store it that way to begin with. So I think that's one thing. And ways to do that are to look at open data portals and just see how they're already keeping records to begin with, look at existing records requests that have been filled, just to give you a sense of how the agency stores its records to begin with. And then the other thing I've seen, and this might be a tale as old as time or a function again of us just having ready access to information, is a lot of times I see journalists, they form a request that's more of a reporting question than it is a request for an existing record. And to recognize the distinction between those two things, that the data you're seeking or the information you're seeking is going to support an argument you're making or a finding. It's not the finding, it's part of it. And the record is not going to necessarily answer every single question you have. That takes interviewing sources and, doing a ton of other research. And you're asking for a document that you might even get, and it might not be helpful. That won't happen most of the time. Don't be too scared. But I think those are the two things where I see people kind of tripping themselves up. And to the extent it's a patience game, it breaks my heart when I see someone wasted 3 or 6 months just by not quite doing that upfront research or not framing the question. And then the agency can be like, well, it's another 6 months until I'm going to get back to you. And I'm like, oh no. So those would be the two things I see most frequently.
Those are real frustrations and good solutions. Now, Azmat, you surfaced one frustration and then you just went ahead and created an organization to solve it through micropayments, which is the energy I think we all need in the FOI space. Are there any other common frustrations that you see and have solutions for?
So one that is kind of related to this is just, being able to hear people or see people open up their processes to you. I feel like I learned a lot from, it wasn't going on Pacer and looking up what people had actually filed and looking at the actual text of what opening up a complaint in a lawsuit and looking at the original request and looking at those, that kind of repository is really useful. And so that's another thing at Gumshoe that we've been doing, is that everybody who gets a grant, for example, and wants and is comfortable with that, we're going to make that accessible to people who want to look at these successful FOIAs or examples of really well-researched ones. Muckrock and others have, really also put out a lot of these kinds of resources. There are a number of organizations, I know Nabiha can talk about that, who do this, but we've been turning some of these into like guides, and you can find them on our website as well. Under the curriculum from all of these talks. So we try to do these crowbar chronicles where a freelance investigative journalist takes you through their process. So there's video, and then there's always a tip sheet that comes out afterwards. And you can find all those tip sheets on our website under the curriculum section. And you can also, talk to people, look at some of these, break them down. There are a lot of people who've done I think, innovative things. And that was just one where I was like, well, why don't we open that up to others?
That's so helpful. And I think, you know, even stepping back for a second, even being able to just upfront say, yes, when you get into this realm, you're going to face some frustrations. Here are the solutions. Also, you're not alone for some of these, right? The delay is something we can all commiserate over. I think these are actually really helpful things to surface for sort of Gen Z, millennials, people who are like, do I need FOI in my reporting? Is this relevant? I think a lot of times the conversations I've been in, especially with like Gen Z reporters, are like, ugh, that doesn't even work. I'm not even going to do it. And I think saying, I see that there's frustrations. You're not wrong. It's not impossible. There is a way forward. I think is just really helpful to help fix a system that, you know, is doing its best, but can be creaky and a little slow at times. If folks have more questions, please do put them into the chat. We have just about 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure we get to questions. We have one interesting hypothetical that covers a topic near and dear to my heart. So, and this is sort of the ever-present tension between public and private. Now, FOIA, of course, FOI is for public institutions. And that made a hell of a lot of sense when FOI was coming into being, because the government was the most powerful actor in the room. And the idea was you need some transparency into the government in order to have some checks and balances, right? To balance out that power asymmetry. What we've seen since the 60s and 70s is that we have private companies becoming more and more and more powerful, but there isn't an FOI for private companies, right? Like getting information around and out of private entities is really tricky. And so this hypothetical, which folks don't have to answer directly if you don't feel comfortable, but I would love to hear your thinking on this topic, I think surfaces this interesting conundrum. So the question is, I'm requesting information from that a university used from its science department, but a privately owned lab is considered the custodian of the records. Also, the FBI has taken the records and refused to turn over the records, citing privacy laws. And what I think is so interesting about this is that it's actually a pretty common setup where you're like, well, the custodian may be private, but it's gone over to a public agency. But if it's part of an investigation, it might be falling under some exemptions that legitimately might create some friction in that avenue, but then the private side doesn't have any obligation to you. Ava, I might turn to you to say, like, how do you even begin thinking through this kind of layered conundrum?
First, I'm going to say, to the extent we love privacy, it is, you know, and we think it's a great personal thing, it can be a really problematic tool in the FOI space where people just claim privacy and you're like, what? Like, how do you refute that? I am going to echo something you said, and I think it's worth saying, and I'm going to sound like a little bit of a schoolmarm. There are occasionally reasons why a record should be withheld. It happens, and it often happens in the event of ongoing law enforcement. I will say there are tons of times in which law enforcement will claim that something shouldn't be released, and you're like, this is not going to interfere with your investigation. That's crazy. But here, I would start by seeing what the FBI, why they're withholding. So what's the basis for the claim? If it is, you know, there's an ongoing investigation, it's like, well, what is that investigation about? Is there any way to figure that out? You know, I might actually start working sources first to see where I could find the loopholes in whatever claim they're making. Because once you're in that active law enforcement space, which I have to think is what's going on in the event that the FBI is making that argument, you're in a tough place. So you're going to have to find nooks and crannies where water flows through if this data is really important to you. And just submitting the FOI on itself is probably not going to get you there without some outside legwork. That might be a little bit of a bummer of an answer, but I will say investigations is one of the hardest things to challenge. It applies even to civil investigations, believe it or not.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? And it's one of those things where it's like patience may be the name of the game, because you maybe need the investigation to close or some other result to happen, but that's tricky. Although the person asking the question said it's a 30-year-old murder case, which certainly adds a different layer. Sounds like. So
in New York, they might still be able to withhold. So I mean, New York's law is not. It's a bit of an outlier, is what I should say. Yeah, I mean, there's theoretically grounds that they would be able to continually withhold, but I would say it's a function of practically what would be like the real world consequence of this data being released. And if you think through that, that can start to help you marshal arguments. But I would imagine this is a lawsuit.
Yeah, it does sound like 30-year-old unsolved murder case. So I want to know more already. Azmat and Lam, do you have any thoughts on the sort of public-private and how you might navigate that? Lam, I know that comes up with sometimes data that you might be after, but if either of you have anything to contribute to that, please do.
Yeah, I actually, like a few years ago, I was looking into a school, a university that it's called Gallaudet University, and it's primarily, it serves like the deaf and hard of hearing. And I was investigating sexual assault among different communities of disabilities. And I really wanted to know the kind of like rape statistics or reported rapes or sexual assaults that were reported to the school. And this is not a university that you can just FOIA, but I knew that they'd received a federal grant to do a lot of this kind of work, in terms of preventing sexual assault, and that there were deliverables for that grant in which, for getting that federal money, they now had to turn into this, this Office of Women. I forget what the office is now that I FOIA'd, but they had to turn into that office these kinds of status reports on their grant that included all of these statistics about how many people had come into their, rape crisis center, how many people had reported that I think faculty had sexually assaulted, how many people had reported, all of these kinds of things that you could not get anywhere else, and they would not for the life of you release. And I think I got it within a month of putting in that FOIA, and I just called up that office, and it was something I hadn't expected. And so that kind of nexus of maybe they have a federal grant, and there's these things that are now with a company, it's a totally different story. It can be really frustrating and hard. I think commercial interests trump so much. I mean, part of what weighs the FOIA system down so much are all of these people who are using it for financial reasons, right? To like outbid one another and their competitors. We could get into what they're trying to do in these situations. I think that's where it gets really hard. And I wish, as a journalist talking about transparency and the need for it and the kind of openness that I think is is the basis for so much of our great reporting. I think that I wish that more congressional leaders, that more advocates and others were able to push. I wish there was more public interest in our maybe expanding what freedom of information should really look like, because there are so many restrictions that I just wish the law was different.
Yeah, I could not agree more. It is a frustration that comes up more and more. And that might be the segue into the last question I have, because we have just a couple of minutes left. So one reason the framing of the panel is even thinking about how to get Gen Z and millennials, what their thoughts are about FOI. I think implicit in that is where do we think FOIA is going, right? What does the future of it look like in the next 15 to 20 years? And one of my many flaws is that I'm an optimist. And I do have to say I'm optimistic that people are interested in this. At the Markup, we published a story about student risk algorithms and how different 400 universities across the country were using algorithms to determine what students were likely to fail out of which degrees. And because of some serious analytical problems, this algorithm was saying, Black students and women were likely to fail out of STEM. So, perhaps the algorithm was flagging them for future review, which of course is horrifying. We published the story. The next day, Texas A&M, an extremely large university, said, we're not using this algorithm anymore. But here's the FOI hook. We got a lot of those records through FOI, and we actually held a teach-in for student journalists around the country to query whether their universities were using this kind of student risk algorithm too. And the interest in learning how to use FOI was honestly way more than I thought it was going to be. And that makes me optimistic about the future. And so I want to end on what you think, each of you quickly thinks is, what does the future hold for FOI in the next 15 years? And Ava, I'll start with you.
I'm optimistic as well. For the first reason is the new governor of New York, in response to the Cuomo administration's kind of famed withholding of information, has actively said they are going to invest more in FOIL, both on a personnel side, start posting more. They're going to be requiring accountability of those agencies, whether this is the personal sentiment of the now governor, Kathy Hochul, or a very politically savvy response to the current state of, the political zeitgeist in New York, feeling like we don't want to be lied to anymore. I'm not sure I care. In fact, I might even prefer the latter, because if politicians see it in their interest to hold the agencies they oversee accountable, maybe because there's this whole issue of misinformation. I'm not sure if anyone's heard about this, but I think there's something there where access to data feels like something people are demanding. They know they're not getting full truths. They want to go to the source. There's inherent distrust, and that might create an incentive structure for the powers that be that really staff a FOIA office to make those decisions about what they're going to release and how they're going to, invest in technological infrastructure. I too am optimistic, and I don't think it's a bad trait.
I love that. Azmat, what about you?
Well, actually, so Nabiha and I, we have a shared love of TikTok, and Nabiha in particular, that predates like the pandemic, like well predates the pandemic. I had to include that. But anyway, one of my favorite things on TikTok, right, for a while now, are just these like Gen Z people who are like, oh, I'm an FBI agent, or, oh, I'm a total stalker. Look at what I found out. And they just break down these like very awesome ways in which they expose something, found something. And I'm just like looking at a lot of this and like stealing tips and tricks from these children who dub themselves FBI agents, which I love. So I'm like taking these tips and tricks, and I'm just like, if I'm borrowing lessons from them, like what are they going to do when they're filing their own requests, when they're looking for ideas? I think I've talked about this before, but I've taught a lot of investigative journalism classes, and I've always found my most talented, the ones with the best pitches, were my high school students in Gen Z. So I actually am very just excited. It's less about the infrastructure that exists than it is about just the kind of people and the talent that is coming up. I'm so excited to see what they do with FOIA.
Oh, I love that. Lam, I'll give you the last word.
No, on that note, I think Gen Z is the most pardon my French, pissed off generation, like understandably so. They've gone through they were born around September 11th, then went through all kinds of climate change issues, are going through their second recession, right? Going through a pandemic that is basically the worst group project in the classroom that you could ever imagine, right? And they are ready. And I think one of the things that I've seen from just reporting on movements right now and movement building, right, is that there are a lot of hungry people out there who are just kind of doing a lot of things on the ground to make their neighborhoods better. And so in some ways, I think FOI is going to be one of the tools in the toolkits of locally sort of motivated grassroots organizations. If we have gotten anything from 2020, I would say maybe of all the people who marched in the streets for a better system within which we live, hopefully we get at least 5% of them going back and doing the work. And I have seen it. I have seen some of the mutual aid groups go one step and two steps further to continue to do this work, right? And so I think what the future of FOI might actually be hyper local and hyper specific. And so it's also the part that's probably the most effective. You're not gonna get that much data from ICE because they are being bombarded with FOI requests from around the country. But you're probably going to get some information from the Suffolk County Police Department in Long Island that has been running a direct pipeline to ICE from high schools for a long time now, right? And that is, I think, the kind of spirit that I hope will carry us further. And I think where organizations like Documented and organizations like City Bureau in Chicago have done incredible legwork to really, really engage with the people who are currently hungry to do something about the effed upness of this world. And as sort of medium, I don't know, level millennial, I don't know where you want to put us, but I think as that, I can only hope that we can kind of that they can forgive us for our sins because we put those poor Gen Zers into this situation. And kind of collaborate with us. My favorite thing is, as Azmat said, is teaching kids. And one of the things I've learned from volunteering with high schoolers is that when you show them how to get the receipts, which is what they use to describe our work, they are there for it, and they will like actually do it over time and consistently. So I'm just like excited to see what they're going to do with this kind of knowledge.
Oh, what a great note to end on. Thank you so much. We have tips and tricks, we have optimism, we have revelations of my TikTok addiction, everything in this panel. Thank you so much for everyone who stayed on, to NFOIC for having us, and to the three of you for just sharing so much for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your great questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.